VP.
VP of the Students' Union at JNU, where he did his MA and MPhil. So we're very happy to hear you today, and I think your presentation, The Growers' Voice, is The Growers' Voice, the Beginnings of Writing Social History in Vernacular. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all. I wanted to thank Lauren, thank Ishan and the faculty who invited me here. Thank you to you all for coming to listen. I appreciate you coming out, and I apologize for making you wait. My partner Manpreet Kaur over there and I were driving from Patiala this morning, and so we literally parked the car and walked to meet Ishan, and we walked over here with a quick stop at the faculty lounge to say hi to a friend. So thank you for your patience. I greatly appreciate it. And if it takes me a couple minutes to get up and running, please forgive me. Again, we just got out of the car, and also, you know, they say the human body is 75% water. We've spent the past week living in a village in rural Punjab, so now my body is 75% ghee, and the other 25% is probably lassi and atta. So it'll take me a little while to get into things, but I'll try to transition into the talk proper in just a moment. How much time do you think we should?
45 minutes?
45 minutes? Oh, yeah. I plan to stop before then. Do we have, since we have a small group, is there time just for people to introduce themselves? Would I be remiss for asking folks? Because then I'll know kind of who we're talking with. And I mean, the great thing about giving talks here as opposed to the United States is that I don't have to explain what Rajasthan is. You know, I don't have to explain where Punjab is or Haryana. You guys are already here.
Or India.
Or India, for that matter, exactly. So that should save us a lot of time. But if I kind of knew where people were coming from, then maybe I could also adjust the talk just a little bit, maybe towards people's interests. I don't know where you want to start. Maybe you could go. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sugandha. I'm in the School of International Affairs, and I'm an anthropologist by training. I also work in Punjab, so I'm interested in looking forward to the
I'm Thomas Michael. I'm a professor and dean of architecture, third generation Chicagoan, and I've been here years.
Nice.
I'm Gagan, and I was also at Jindal for my PhD, and I just joined the university, and I also looked at a bit of Punjab and Afghanistan, 19th century, in my thesis.
Nice.
With the university, grew up with communities contemporary, the margins of Delhi.
Nice.
I'm Kaushali. I joined Open University this July. I did my examination in June, and I come from Bengal.
Okay.
So maybe the border histories are something we could see.
Sure.
Looking forward.
I'm Ishan. I teach history in journalism and communication school, and I come from a region which is often seen as the antithesis of Punjab.
So I'm Laurence, and I'm from France, and I teach history at the Liberal Arts School. I work more on Muslim citizenship in India post-partition.
I'm Manpreet. I'm a PhD candidate at India. Also know Swati through AIS. And I'm just here finishing up my paper and going back to writing my dissertation, which is about collaborative writing and performance practices in early modern North India. So I do literary history and a little bit of ethnography. Yeah, so it's great to be here.
Hi, I'm Mohsen. I teach in the School of International Affairs. I focus mostly in South Asia.
I'm Swati. I just joined as faculty here in the Liberal Arts and Humanities School, which is French class. Yeah, I just finishing my PhD at the University of Virginia in history.
My name is Chris. I'm from Australia. I did my PhD at the University of Melbourne. I am an archaeologist, but I'm interested in material culture and materiality more broadly.
Hello, I'm Maria. I'm teaching in the School of Liberal Arts, and I'm from France, and I'm a little bit a different specialty. I'm a psychologist, but I'm very much interested in the rural aspect of it.
I'm Tom Goldstein. I'm the dean of the School of Journalism
We have 2 deans in this. Yeah, I'm a bit, oh, right, yes, yeah. Okay, I have never had 2 deans sitting on any of my talks. So, yeah, right, the pressure is on. Well, okay, I'll try to keep you all entertained, and I'll try to keep it brisk again because we started a little late. Thanks for telling me about what you do, because I'm kind of trying to figure out, and I'll talk about more about this in a second, is where to kind of pitch this. Hi, Galera. Where to pitch this material, how technical to make it, because this started its life as a dissertation chapter, you know, more than a decade ago now, and is going into book form hopefully soon. And this, you know, again, thank you for giving me this opportunity. This is a chance for me to workshop some of the ideas and see if they make sense to folks who are maybe not necessarily swimming in the ocean of pre-colonial religiosity in North India all the time. And I should clarify that what I'm talking about today is primarily pre-colonial stuff. This is really the 15th century through 18th, and as you'll see, the focus is really on the 17th and the 18th centuries. However, everything I'm talking about today really goes, everything that I'm talking about today still goes on today, in the sense that the kind of phenomena I'm discussing is happening right now, probably, you know, a kilometer away from here, somewhere in a mandir, or somewhere in a temple, or somewhere in a dera. Right, and the second thing I should clarify is that I'm not the Punjab expert per se. I do work on Punjabi material, and I do work on pre-modern Punjabi material stuff, that songs and sayings that you find in, say, the Guru Granth Sahib of the Sikhs. And I'm starting to get more into Punjabi manuscript culture. But the real expert on Punjab is over there, Manpreet Kaur. And so the reason we're coming from Punjab right now is really her ethnographic work there, which is fascinating. And maybe I'll actually point to it later. So the title for the talk is, I originally started it in 2 languages because these days I'm going to these bilingual conferences, and they've got me in the mood for that. The Guru's voice is something that encompasses all of this, because even though I'm going to be talking about writing, the other side of writing in pre-colonial South Asia is always orality and oral performance. There is no writing that exists without an oral dimension. And so really I'm going to be concentrating on the notion of the voice here. The Hindi title, Bachan Sumeran Karao Nan Avalokita, Shravana Gun Hir Katha Puri Rakhi, is a line from Ravidas, actually, the Ravidas of yore of the 16th century, probably the 16th century, it's hard to be sure. Bachan Sumeran Karao, I am going to remember you with my speech, Nan Avalokita, I will look at you with my eyes, Shravan Gun Hir Katha Puri Rakhi, and I will keep you, or I will remember you, or abide by you by listening to your gun, to your qualities, and keeping your story, right, your katha. And the reason I use this quotation is actually because of this strange, because of the multisensory aspect of it, Nan Avalokita. When those of us who work on pre-colonial Indian literature talk about literature in the vernacular, right, which for me is Hindi, but for others would be, say, pre-colonial Bengali or pre-colonial Punjabi or Marathi, we tend to think about it in terms of orality as popular oral texts, right? And we don't think about its commitment to writing and the materiality of that writing very much, at least not until recently. What struck me here is the Nan Avalokita, I will see you with my eyes, and that made me think about writing as something that is looked at and something that can be visually impressive. And we'll see that after a few minutes in the case of scriptural books, codices, holy books, books that were made, that were constructed to be visually impressive and function as a focal point of ritual. So the main question I'm asking today is what changes in a tradition when texts begin to be committed to writing? In this case, religious traditions. What kind of changes do they go through structurally, socially, in terms of their ritual culture when they begin writing down the sayings of their gurus, of the leaders of the tradition? And second, how are writing, and I use this word writing here to mean two things. One, writing as a practice, actually sitting down and inscribing things. And two, writing as a material text artifact, as a thing, right? To borrow that term from, oh gosh, ENT, thing theory. Who is thing theory is? Not Bourdieu. Oh gosh, ENT, actor network theory. Latour, thank you, gosh, yeah, sorry. Again, I'll blame it all on 3 hours on the road. So writing is two things. One is as a thing in the Latourian sense of something that works as an agent between human actors, and as a practice, an embodied practice of writing. Second, the concept of religious scripture, and I put that in scare quotes because scripture is, of course, a term derived from Latin, scriptus, scriptorium, the idea that we have a relatively modern idea that scriptures are something that are written, an idea that has been challenged as being a concept unfit for application in a South Asian context because works of Itihasa like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, or Padas, lyrics like those of Ravidas or Kabir Das, the saints of the medieval and early modern period, were not written down. They were experienced as lived song and as lived recitation. But I'm going to challenge that and say written books were important. We can talk about scripture in pre-colonial India. And finally, historical consciousness, an idea of things happening in historical time, in our times. How are these three things connected together? And this is an intervention. I'm making a small intervention into a larger debate that's going on for about a decade now. And that that debate was kicked off by Shelley Pollack, who's now at Columbia, when he proposed that vernacular languages, again, Bengali, Marathi, Punjabi, Hindi, were essentially suppressed and kept out of the realm of the written. They were not simply not written down because they were ignored, but they were actually excluded from the realm of writing in South Asia and consequently from the realm of the literary and literature. In other words, nothing but Sanskrit, text in Sanskrit could be literature or could be scholastic text, scholastic discourse, due to a linguistic ideology that privileged Sanskrit as the only possibly universal medium for intellectual and literary discourse and debate. And that being the first of Pollack's arguments, the second being that, contrary to scholastic opinion up to that point, it was courtly elites, political elites in medieval and early modern India who first took up the vernacular and by A, writing it down, and B, reforming the vernacular in terms of genre and style and usage according to the norms established by Sanskrit. In other words, trying to make Bengali more like Sanskrit, trying to make Punjabi more like Sanskrit. By doing so, these courtly elites made the vernacular a language that then could be used for literary and intellectual purposes. This was quite controversial because up until that time, it was kind of it was conventional wisdom that actually it was popular religious movements that brought the vernacular from the margins into the center of social, religious, and intellectual life and political life in the subcontinent. My position is, I'll get to later, somewhere in between. Somewhere, it was both groups. And it was actually because of writing. Writing was what joined these two kind of camps of the courtly and the popular together and allowed them to, in tandem, work on this project of elevating the vernacular. Let's see, where are we? This is the roadmap, as it were, for the talk. I think because starting late, I'll spend maybe just 5 minutes on each of these. And hopefully not too briskly, but just to give you the most general sense of what's going on in this world. And that world is, again, really the 17th and 18th centuries, and is the world of the Sikh community, which is associated with Punjab, but actually extended quite far past the borders of modern Punjab back in the 17th century. The Dadu Panth, a lesser-known group that is associated with bhakti religiosity, the devotional, the effusive, emotional, devotional movement or network, if you will, or mode of religiosity that in North India started around the 15th century and continues on until today. The Dadu Panth and the Niranjani Sampradaya were both groups from Rajasthan, communities from Rajasthan that coalesced around charismatic guru figures. The Dadu Panth around Dadu Dayal, and the Niranjani Panth around a figure named Haridas, who I'll mention in a moment. And these three communities and their scriptures are the meat of this talk. That's the content. Those are the things I'll be talking about. What I'll have to say about them is first, I'll talk a little bit about how the sayings, the sayings and the songs of those gurus, the real meat and potatoes, as we say in the US. Probably a bad metaphor in this, especially if we've got Vaishnavas in the bhakti mix. It's the real, it's the sabzi, it's the dal and roti of their scriptural traditions. These songs and these sayings of the founding saints are what constitutes scripture later on. And I'll talk about how they were written down and anthologized and edited. The second thing I'll talk about is why materiality matters. Why the physical form that these books take, that these books took, these anthologies of the saints' poetry, why their physical, their material, their visual aspects are important for understanding what these things, these objects meant, how they were to the communities that used them and how they were used in different contexts. I'll say just a few words about how these three communities historicized the revelation and the lives of their gurus, and in the way that they talk about how those written scriptures came to be. And finally, I'll talk a little bit more about how these books, how these religious holy books were used in different contexts, and how that helped bring the guru, even after he had passed, bring him back into being over and over again, each time there was a gathering of the faithful. And that's why I say the guru at court and on the road. And then I'll turn to some conclusions about what this might mean methodologically for the way that we study written scriptures in early modern India. So to start with, and there are a few other, I should say, two notes before we really dive into it. The first is that this is part of a book project, as I mentioned, and to give you some context, the book project essentially asks what would happen if we told the history of Hindi literature not from the point of view of genres or authors or works as we normally do, but what if we just sat down with the piles of paper of whatever we have left of those handwritten books and manuscripts and even notes and notebooks that were written before the colonial period, before printing brought about a certain epistemic rupture. What would those books, the actual physical material remains, tell us about the way texts were written down, circulated, and enjoyed by people, how they were used? And actually, it turns out, thank goodness for me, because I needed to have a thesis and a point to the book, is that it turns out that how we would write that history is quite different than how you would do it if you took genre as your organizing principle, or say authors or individual works as your organizing principle. The second thing I'll say is that it is, as some of you who work on kind of devotional communities in South Asia know, it's not common to talk about Sikhs and nominally Hindu groups together, right? In fact, and there are numerous reasons for this, and some of them are good reasons that help us to see how these traditions developed independently. But in fact, with these three in particular, the more you look at the material, the more you realize that they grew up together. They grew up in conversation with each other. And if we take that as a starting point, we again see in fact, these folks are working out an idea of scripture together. And the interesting part about that, and again, it's a bit of a challenge to convince conventional wisdom on the topic, is that like so many things these days, in the past 35 years or so, we've realized the extent of that epistemic rupture that happens at the colonial moment when, for example, Orientalists, archaeologists, the ethnographers come and they say, well, come from Europe, occasionally the Americas, and say, you know, well, what are the holy books of the Hindus, or what are the holy books of South Asian religious communities? And the problem, first of all, is that they're looking for a material book, which may not exist at all. And so the idea, again, that scripture, written scripture, is an imposition, right, of Orientalist thought and colonial scholastic thought. Again, that is true to a large extent. However, looking at these three groups, we'll have to reevaluate that, because in fact they were very invested in writing down scripture and the idea of written scripture before the colonial moment arrives. And in fact, they're not the only ones. We see that Abul Fazl in the Ain-i Akbari is writing in the late 16th century that, oh, as everyone knows, the Hindus have books, have holy books, and they are this one, and this other one. And so in fact, this imagining of Indic religion or South Asian religion as something that has written books is something older than colonial scholarship. So as, you know, and, you know, I apologize if I'm running over familiar territory, but the Sikhs, of course, is a community founded by Guru Nanak, who lived from 1469 to 1539. He was, of course, followed by 9 other gurus. After him, the line of gurus being closed by Guru Gobind Singh in 1708, when he establishes the Guru Granth Sahib as the eternal guru. And I'll talk more about that soon. However, the Guru Granth Sahib was not compiled in 1708. It was compiled in 1604 in the first version of it by Guru Arjan, the 5th Guru, at Ramdaspur, later Amritsar. The Dadu Panth, on the other hand, was founded about that same moment, relatively speaking, by Dadu Dayal, who was a cotton carter and a saint, possibly from Gujarat, but who made his name in Rajasthan, preaching to communities there through his hymns and through his epigrammatic poems. The first type of scripture that appears in the Dadu Panth is a collection of his compositions, which starts to be compiled around 1603. I actually think it wasn't exactly at 1603 that it was compiled. It was a bit later, but it's called the Dadu Vani, Vani meaning voice or words. And after that, there are 2 other major scriptural anthologies of saintly utterance in the Dadu Panth called the Panchvani and the Sarv Angi, the 5 voices and the all themes, or the all-inclusive of all angs, literally limbs, that were compiled in the 1610s and 1620s, actually. And I'll talk about what types of scriptures those are later. And finally, the Niranjani Sampradaya, as I mentioned earlier, it was founded by a figure about whom we know relatively little, named Haridas Niranjani in central Rajasthan, a town called Didwana, who he died most likely around 1600 or 1601. And in this religious community, they have large anthologies of the saints' poetry, which are simply just called Vanis. It has no specific name. And I'll talk a little bit more about why, again, later. They were all of these were, all right, so let's back up here a little bit. They were all, 3 of these communities, as I was saying earlier, were influenced by one another. And what I wanted to do, oh, it's not letting me do that. Here, let's try this first. In show. There we go. I wanted to give you a spatial sense of that. So let's see here. Let's take Kartarpur out of the mix. So this is the Mughal Empire around 1605 when all of this is happening. This is its extent at Akbar's death. This is the extent at which kind of Hindi literature, as we call it. And Hindi literature, there was no such thing as Hindi as we know it now. Instead, there was kind of a trans-regional language, which was simply called Bhasha, or spoken language, in which these saints were composing their songs and sayings. And among those, let's just take a look here. Right. By mapping, among other things, not only the monasteries of the Dadu Panth, which is in light yellow, and the Niranjani Sampradaya, which is in orange, but also by mapping where manuscripts were copied by using the colophons at the end of manuscripts, in which the scribe would say, on this date I finished copying this book in such and such village, we can actually get an extent of how far, of the geographic extent of their activity. You'll see up here, let me add Kartarpur. Just a little bit to the north here, we have Ramdaspur, which is in the present day known as Amritsar. And this city, this capital, so to speak, of the Sikh community was being established at the very moment that all three of these groups were establishing their written scriptures. The reason I bring this up is to give you extent of how much these groups overlapped in terms of the geographical area in which their monks and devotees were active. In any case, let's see, there we go. Okay. Actually, let's just go straight to, to talk about what these scriptures are that they were creating. The core, again, of each of these scriptural collections, the Guru Granth Sahib of the Sikhs, the various Vanis or anthologies of the Niranjani Panth, the Dadu Panth and the Niranjani Sampradaya, are of two types. Okay, the first, let's back up here. The first type is the pad, and some of you will already be familiar with this. This is a lyric, right? This is the kind that is sung, right? For example, Mirabai has a famous lyric. Me tu savran ki rang rachi, right? I am dyed in the color of the dark one, right? In which she sings about her love for Krishna. The saints in these three groups tended to sing about their devotion to a nirgun God, a God that had no form, a God that could not be known, that was ineffable, it could not be described. The other type of composition that these saints created in great quantity was the Saki. And the Saki is actually just a name of a genre. The actual metrical form is a doha, or it's called a salok sometimes. It's an epigrammatic verse. Karata karata abhyas ke jardmat hot sujan. Rasi, sorry, avjat se. Sil padat nashan, right? So again, this is Kabir saying, by practicing over and over, even the stupid or the foolish one becomes wise, just as the going back and forth of a rope will eventually leave a mark on a rock. It's pithy little verses like this, through which religious ideas, the idea of bhakti, of devotion being the most important element of religiosity, were spread by these saints. Now, those are the vast bulk of the textual material in all of these scriptures, but along with them are some other forms like the chopai, which can also be a lyric or a narrative genre, and importantly, the pariche, right? The introduction, the thing that makes you familiar with a saint. In other words, hagiographies. So these are found in some of them as well. So in the case of the Sikhs, this was the first, let's say the first edition of the Guru Granth Sahib was compiled in 1604, again by Guru Arjun, who is here on the right in an 18th century painting, in which you can see the Harmandir Sahib, or the Golden Temple of the Sikhs in Amritsar, being built as the Amritsar, or the lake itself, is being constructed. This was to be the home for the Guru Granth Sahib. In other words, it was to be the home for the scriptural work, for the holy book. And if you go there today, you can see it being treated in royal fashion there. And I'll speak more about that later. It is organized primarily by raga. In other words, the overarching organizational logic of it is one of music. the lyrics are organized according to the rags in which they should be performed, but also according to mahal, which mahalla is a system of organizing the composers, those being the gurus, the Sikh gurus. It also includes a rag mala at the end, which again foregrounds the performance aspect of this. There's actually a rag mala is a versified treatise on what are the main ragas, the sub-ragas, and the sub-sub-ragas. In other words, it's a musicological text right there around the end of the Guru Granth Sahib, along with Baramasas, or Songs of 12 Seasons, and other works. But its main material are the songs and the epigrams. The Dadupanthi anthologies, which I mentioned earlier, there we go. The Daduvani is, again, a collection of the verses of the founder of the Dadu Panth, both his songs and his sayings. The Panchvani, on the other hand, is a different type of scripture in that it takes the songs and sayings of 5 different prominent saints of the period: Kabir, Ravidas, Haridas, Namdev, Dadu, occasionally another saint. And so you say, well, that's more than 5, as is suggested by the name Panchvani, because Panchvani means the 5 voices. That's because not all copies of the Panchvani have the same 5 saints in them, which is a moment in the development of this community in which the canon is still being developed. And it is, and there's no sign of conflict there, but there's a sign of fluidity in who are the 5 most important saints of the tradition. The next 2 sets of collections there, the Sarvangi of Rajab Das and the Sarvangi of Gopal Das, these are 2 really gargantuan anthologies of saint songs and poems which are organized thematically. And by anga. And anga simply means limb, as in a limb of the body, or a theme. And so you'll have a section just about just about the greatness of the guru. You'll have a section of songs and sayings just about how you should abstain from sexual desire. You'll have a section on how God, on the theme of how God cannot be described. Finally, you have the Niranjanis, and the Niranjani Vani, and this is quite interesting. It has all copies of the Niranjani Vani, from those that were created in the mid-1600s to those that were created in the mid-1800s, all have a core of the same saints in there. Haridas, the founder, will be there. There are 5 or 6 other saints of the tradition which will definitely be there. But then the other contents can change. There will be hagiographies in there. There might even be scholastic texts in there. And the reason for that, as I'll discuss later, is their owners, the gurus of the tradition, the actual teachers and monks, would have these custom made for them, these copies custom made, so that in addition to having the songs and sayings of the primary saints of the tradition, when they were on the road, they would have whatever other material they needed for teaching and for preaching. Okay, now this is really kind of where the how to say it. This is really where the argument of this presentation starts. Is where materiality matters. There are a couple of let's see here. Oh, right. The first, there are a lot of things we don't pay attention to as literary scholars when we study this stuff. Whether we're working from printed editions, which leave out a lot of the stuffs that used to be in manuscripts, or we're even looking at those manuscripts, we kind of look at them and say, okay, manuscript starts off with an Om, Ganesha Nayama, obeisances to Ganesha. Okay, let's get all that out of the way and get out of the way and move on to the actual body text, the works I want to read. But those paratexts are extremely important. And one of the reasons why is that if you look at what I put up here now, this is what's called a gutka. It's a notebook. And in Rajasthan and parts of Gujarat and Punjab, these little notebooks are what singers used, singers and some monks used when they were going to sing these lyrics, these religious hymns that I've been discussing, the hymns of the gurus. Now you'll notice it's not very well copied. This is actually, for a notebook of the time, this is great handwriting. This is very easy to read. It gets much, much worse than this. Those of you who can read Devanagari will note that there are some verse numbers, and there's even a mention of a teka, of a refrain. But that's about as much information in one of these notebooks as you'll get, because the person was writing it for themselves. They weren't writing it for someone else to read. And you'll see that there's a folio number up on the upper left hand. That was added later. That's not the scribe's work. In other words, there are no paratexts. And what is a paratext? A paratext is something like an introduction, a page number, a subject heading, anything that helps you navigate or make sense or frames the material there. None of that are in the earliest notebooks of these traditions. However, when you begin to look at, let me move here. Right, okay. Right, when you start to look at these scriptural anthologies that were made to be written scriptures, that were produced to be written scriptures, you start to see that, oh wait, there's a lot of this paratextual material which frames this as scripture, as something that's more than normal utterance, that's more than a song, that is more than just a rhyme, a lyric. This is something more important. This says, Sri Naranjanaya Narayan Namaha, obeisances to Sri Naranjan, an appellation to God. Sri Gana Dvipatapata Namaha, again, an obeisance to Ganesha. Sri Sakala Santana Maha Parushaya Namaha, obeisances to all the great men, to all of the saints. Atta Gusai Ji Shri Shri Tulsidas Ji Ko Krita Likyate. Here is written the grantha, the work, the literary work or the religious work of the great Tulsidas, which is the name of a saint. In other words, these paratexts reframe all of those hymns and sayings as something else. Now, what that is, I'm going to talk about more as I talk about materiality. Now, in addition to being the way these books look, these holy books look, is very different from other manuscripts of the period. First, it's very different from these types of notebooks that are very simply stitched. They've got a saddle stitch down the middle. The handwriting is very rough. The margins, if they have them at all, are inconsistent. They're also different from these. These are pothis. This is the most, let's argue that this is the most common type of manuscript in North India in the medieval and early modern period. It's a bunch of unbound folios. They're not tied together. They're loose sheets of paper, and they're turned over very ceremoniously in pedagogical and ritual sessions. This is how you would write a serious work of Shastra, right, an intellectual treatise or a religious treatise, or it's how you would copy, say, the Bhagavata Purana, or it's how you would copy, say, the Itihasas, right? This is how you would copy these kinds of works that we associate with Hindu scripture, is in this format and with your paratexts in red and like this. No, these books do not look like that. If you've seen a copy of the Guru Granth Sahib, early copies from the early 17th century look like this, right? First of all three of these community scriptures are bound codices, right? Which means they're portrait format. They look like this. They look like a book, a modern day codex book. In the case of the sixth scripture, they are produced in a very sophisticated manner. The bindings, I know you have been waiting all day to hear about book bindings, and I promise I will not go too deep into them, but the manner in which these are bound is quite sophisticated, and it is what, for lack of a better term, an Islamic technology that comes from the Persian and the Arabic bookbinders of the day. Not only that, if you look at what's at the top of this is called an unvan, right, a title page, and the triangular shape is a taj, right? That and the florets and the floral and geometric decoration are all mimicry of what was produced in Quranic manuscripts of the time, as well as some Persian and Arabic non-religious manuscripts of the time. But as Gurinder Singh Mann has suggested, the early Sikh gurus were probably well aware of the importance of the Quran as a focal point for ritual in Islamic communities, Muslim communities of the time, because even if not all members of the community could read, they all had physical access to the codex of the Quran. In any case, the pagination conventions and otherwise the layout of the early Guru Granth Sahib copies, and even of the Sikh anthologies which were collated and from which the first Guru Granth Sahib was anthologized, edited, and created, which are these, the Goindwal Potis, copied in the 1570s. If you look at this looks like a Persian or Arabic manuscript from the period. All sorts of things in there, from the illumination that you see in the top left-hand corner to the Jadwal, which are the ruling boxes and the margin lines, to the Bin-e-Satur, which is the shading between the letters that have been calligraphed, down to the calligraphy, the style of calligraphy itself. This is Gurmukhi, right? The script that was specifically engineered in the Sikh community for Sikh religious writings. All of this is done to be visually impressive, right? To put it succinctly. In the case of the Niranjani Panth, the Dadu Panth and then the Niranjani Sampradaya, the material manuscripts of their scriptures are perhaps less technically sophisticated. They're what we call one signature or one gathering. Instead of the kind of kettle stitch, I don't know, if you know how a modern book is bound, you take lots of little groups of paper and you fold them over. So you have maybe 8 pages folded over one another, and then you take many, many of those gatherings and you stitch them together with something that's called a link or a kettle stitch. This, on the other hand, just has one big pile. If you can imagine taking around 150 to 200 pages stacked on top of each other. Don't try to do this, it's impossible, with printer paper, and fold them over and then stitch them through the middle. Of course, they had to be created in a way that they could last, and that is certainly true of these books. This one, for example, is from the early 1720s, I think, and is still can still be read today at Sangakua, in Didwana at the Niranjani Monastery there. These two were meant to be visually impressive and are replete with paratextual material. This is a table of contents, one of about 20 pages of the table of contents for that same manuscript that you saw on the photo. And what this does is it gives the user unprecedented ability to move around and find material at a glance. We don't think about it now, but tables of contents were a major innovation at this point, at the turn of the 17th century. There are no vernacular manuscripts before then that have tables of contents. And in fact, very few Sanskrit manuscripts from the period have anything like that. And relatively few Arabic or Persian manuscripts from the period do either. And so this was a major, major innovation. And it allowed, again, a guru, a monk who was teaching, to be able to get what they needed super fast. Again, very visually impressive. These are beautiful texts. And they also, in addition to just being beautiful to look at with their use of multicolored inks, that's a particularly stunning example, and a relatively high quality of calligraphy. I want to point out something at the top. Could anyone read the first 2 lines of it? It's a little bit hard to see in this light. Right, the second line is just Ram, 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 Ram. The name of God, over and over. Not the Ram with the bow, who's married to Sita, but Ram, the Nirgun, ineffable Ram. But before that, what's at the top? It is just what you think it is. It's just Ra, over and over and over again. And what this points to is a use of writing which is essentially not instrumental or utilitarian, writing for writing's sake, writing that's not meant to be read. Right, the first, and you find lots of examples of this in these types of manuscripts, it's very unlikely that the guru, that the monk or teacher who's using this to sermonize is saying it has to look at this to be reminded to chant the name of Ram, right? Or to do a mantra. And yet you find these in there. And what it suggests is that there's an understanding that the material instantiation of powerful utterance, mantra, being a powerful form of utterance, the name of God being a powerful form of utterance, an evolving notion that if that's given material form, then that material instantiation itself has some form of power, partakes in that power to some extent or another. So there are all sorts of types of writing not to be read that you find in these books. I just want to share this. This is a gorgeous example. And again, I want to say these are large, very large manuscripts. They're about the size of this, which you find relatively few bound manuscripts from this period which are that large. So these are clearly meant to be used in liturgy, in communal ritual, where you have the devotees gathered around you. You're sitting there as the guru, as the teacher, with this open book, and you're reading from it. Okay. I think, can I take 5 more minutes to conclusion? Yeah. Okay. So how do the communities talk about the compilation and the inscription of their own scriptures? This is what's interesting, is in their hagiographies, their hagiographical material, the versified stories they tell about the saints of their tradition, all 3 of these communities make sure to tell you details about how things were written down. In the case of Nanak, we have multiple references to him carrying around a book, which is assumed to be a collection of his own poetry, and that this was passed down from guru to guru to guru, and it's believed that the Guru Har Sahai Poti, which is a copy, this original copy was in existence until, I think, maybe 30 years ago when it was stolen. And it was kept at a Gurdwara in the Punjab, incidentally, that we saw a few days ago, and well, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that later. There's also, Sikh hagiography talks a lot about how it was compiled by Guru Arjan, how he had Bhai Gurdas, not one of the Sikh gurus, but one of kind of the right-hand man devotee of the Abu Fazl to his Akbar, if you will, of Guru Arjan, sat with him and meticulously copied all of this down. It is not, it's mundane. Paying attention to the mundane details of the copying is something that stands out to you in these hagiographies that otherwise talk about miracles being worked. On one hand, they're talking about the gurus, stopping a boulder with their hand or making a spring of water come out of the ground. On the other hand, they're stopping to talk about the details of copying something down. So this is striking. In the case of the Dadu Panth and the Niranjani Sampradaya, the attention is put on who were the guru's followers who followed him around and transcribed things for him. And I want to quote just one of those, the Dadu Janam Leela, or the divine play of the life of Guru Dadu, of Jan Gopal, which was probably composed between 1603 and 1620. He says, Ye katta swami duvare rakhe, sangi chale ju katta me bhake, keso aru baba bhagavanu, madho santadasa pravanu, sikka mohana daftari bancho, Hari Guna Likhe Gur Su Sancho. So Swami Dadu left some disciples in the monastery. Those that went with him are told in this story, the story that I'm about to tell you. Keshav and Baba Bhagwan, Madhav and Sant Das the True. The disciple Mohan Daftari recited and wrote down Hari, or God's virtues, as he witnessed them from the Guru. This is a reference to someone whose name, a devotee of Dadu, whose name was Mohan Das Daftari. That name Daftari tells you he was an accountant whose job it was to put together and rule account books, right? So he had a very mundane type of literacy, an everyday type of literacy. Here he's using it to transcribe each word of the Guru as it comes from the Guru's mouth. Later on, and this is a quote from a different hagiography, the Sant Gun Sagar, which claims to be from the 1604. It's a little bit later. We hear about how after the death of the Guru, of Dadu, Mohandas Daftari and three of the most prominent, the highest authorities in the Dadu Pantha got together to make a critical edition of those. And so, Dadu Guru Nija Ayasu Pavata Rajaba Mohana Sri Jagannatha Saki Hushoda Anukrama Rakata Talaru Raga Garibahi Satha. So I'll just skip to the translation. Receiving orders from the Guru, Dadu himself, right? From the Guru himself. It's the Guru who told us to write this down. And he said, Rajab, Mohan, and Sri Jagannath, revise these sakis, put them in order. And they did the same thing for the talas and the ragas, the songs, together with Garib Das. Garib Das was the Guru's successor and son. All the sakis, those epigrammatic verses, were written down in 37 chapters, and the devotional songs in 27 ragas. In this way, the Sant inscribed the Guruvani, and it became famous everywhere. Now, before I move to my last point in conclusion, I want to remark on what's remarkable about this. It's that if we look at the framing stories of, say, Itihasa, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, or if we look at, say, the framing of the Dharmashastras of Manu, or even of the Natya Shastra, right, a text on dramaturgy, we have how are these texts come to be written down? We're told in the texts themselves that you have a god or a rishi who's dictating something, dictating the text to another god or rishi who is writing it down. This is happening in mythological time, right? And even in the case of something like the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas, right? The events that frame it are actually conversations that go on between gods, right? That's it's Tulsidas is incidental to this in terms of writing it down. Here, though, we have some traditions which talk about this happening in historical time. Oh no, the Gurus lived among us. They spoke among us. They have these hagiographies tell you the names and villages of the people who came to meet the Guru, and tell you the same information for the people who then went and wrote all of the Guru's sayings down. So this revelation happens in historical time, and the writing of it down is what gives you kind of a benchmark to say this is when it happened. And the dates for the writing, or the dates for the inscription of these holy anthologies are mentioned. Finally, the Guru at the court and on the road. This is where things diverge a little bit in the models of scripture of, say, the Sikh community on the one hand, and the Dadu Panth and the Niranjani Sampradaya on the other. In the case of the Sikhs, right, from the moment it was consecrated, the early Guru Granth Sahib was kept in one place. And if you looked at those photographs of it, it's a large monumental type of book, though you find also smaller copies of it. Most of the large copies, and I want to here point to Manpreet's work, because she is looking at material aspects of some of the early copies of the Guru Granth Sahib. They're large. You can't move them. It's not easy to transport these things. They're meant to be in one place, and that place is the space of a Gurdwara. And those of you who are familiar with a Gurdwara, Sikh temple, know that it's laid out in the shape of a dargah, not the place of a Muslim holy man's burial, but dargah in the sense of court, of a holy court. And you know that the ritual that developed around the Guru Granth Sahib, and it's hard to date the exact development of certain aspects of that ritual, but it's clear that it was going on at least by the early 18th century, is that the Guru Granth Sahib is treated as both guru and as sovereign, right, in a space of Gurdwara, which is articulated in terms of a courtly ritual, right? That is also the case in one place in the Dadu Panth, and that place is at its central monastic institution called the Dadu Dwara, the door of Dadu, at this town called Narayana in Rajasthan, not far from Jaipur. And there you'll see, seated back inside there in a very Garbhagriha, inter sanctum sanctorum type space, is a copy of the Dadu Vani, right? And the other aspects of this particular building, which was built relatively later, which was not built in the 17th century, but was built later, is in the form of a Davani Khas in the region. It's in the form of where it mimics the space in which a king or a petty Rajput chieftain would sit. And in fact, the architectural program of the entire monastery mimics that of a palace, right? With a nakarkhana, with a drum house at the top, and so on and so forth. So in this case, you see that the book is treated like the guru. However, in the case of the in other copies of the Dadu Vani and copies of the Niranjani Vanis, they were used and they are revered in a very different way. As I was mentioning earlier, gurus in the Dadu Panth and the Niranjani Sampradaya would have their disciples inscribe for them a copy of the sacred works of the saints, along with what other material they might need when they were teaching. They spent 9 months of the year teaching, right, by going from town to town, city to city, village to village, and 3 months back at their home monastery copying texts. And when they would go out into the field, they had, therefore, these vadamakams, right, as you say in Latin, these nice codices that were easy to transport, but again, visually impressive, from which they could do their entire liturgy, everything they needed, the hagiographies, the songs, the epigrammatic verses, even scholastic things, if they wanted to get into that level of depth with their congregations, were all at their fingertips. When they died, and this is particularly the case in the Niranjani Sampradaya, not as much in the Dadu Panth, when these gurus would go into samadhi, we don't actually say that they died, they went into samadhi. In other words, they went into meditation, left their bodies, and never came back. Their bodies, because these are holy men and not ordinary men, were buried and not burnt. And samadhis, like the one you see here, were built over that place where the body was buried. What you find in them is their gudurdi, their patchwork quilt that they would carry with them, their personal effects, and, very importantly, a copy of their personal scripture, right? Their copy, which they carried around with them, which, as the colophon at the end of it says, was copied specifically for them. And that book is not read from, and it's not used in literature. It is instead revered, right? It is revered, for lack of a better word, worshipped along with the other personal effects of the saint as having a power in and of itself, right? As possessing, in its material form, some of the aura of the guru who used it, okay? So in other words, to sum it all up, right, what did these written scriptures do? They like a diptych, okay? Like opening a book, you've got 2 pages one on each side. One side is that they're a material instantiation of the utterance of the guru. And we know, right, from the linguistic ideology that these saints espouse, that they believe that utterance is powerful. You say the name of Ram, good things are going to happen, right? Here we have that written down, right? These powerful utterances written down, and the physical form, the material and visual form they were given seemed appropriate to that, right? They're visually impressive, they're large, they're treated unlike other books, right? When their owners go away, these books are also put into samadhi, right? The other thing is that the whole purpose of the book, though, right, was not to be read from silently, right? We know that there was no silent reading in these communities. It was always for the guru, the living guru, to read out from that and read out those powerful utterances to the congregations, right? To the devotees. In other words, to recreate that oral event of powerful utterance of the original guru, right? And here we come back to the names of these anthologies, of the scriptures themselves. One, they're called Vanis. What is Vani? The word, the utterance. The physical object is also called the Vani. When you read from it, you are making the guru speak. It's like what you say when you read books in Sanskrit, vachayati, to make the book speak, right? The other name, Guru Granth Sahib. The guru, right? The Granth. What is Granth? It comes from tying together, both in the sense of we have tied all of these sayings of the saints together, and we have physically stitched this book together, all right? And so this is where it all kind of ideologically comes together. And so what can this tell us for an approach? Well, I would say 2 or 3 things in conclusion. I would say that the first thing we have to pay attention to is the mundane and the material, right? Pay attention to the materiality of these texts, right? That's going to tell us something about how they were circulated, how they were used, what people thought of kind of the metaphysical status of the contents of the books. And this is not clear necessarily only from the textual contents of the manuscripts themselves. The second is we need to pay attention to that paratextual material. You can find the same lyric, the same epigram in multiple types of manuscripts, but the paratexts tell you how it was understood, right? How it was to be used and performed. The third thing, or the final thing I would say is that it helps to take all of this information, right? The actual abstract textual material, the aspects of the material culture around these manuscripts, and what we know from the architectural evidence, right? What kind of spaces were they performed in? What kind of spaces were they kept in? What did a library look like? Or in this case, what did a samadhi look like? And again, that gives you a greater sense, a fuller sense of what these things, these books meant as things, per se. Or let me put it in a more Latourian sense, what these things did, what they got people to do. Because as you know, the first thing you do when you go into a Gurdwara is you walk straight up to the Guru Granth Sahib, to the Baba, and you bow, right? So in this case, you're not doing something to the book. The book is asking you to do something to it. So I'll stop there. Thank you again for listening and again for your patience today. Thanks.